Brian Cropp, and he's going to be, he's actually an experienced writer of plays and short stories. He'll be speaking his second speech from the Competent Communication Manual. And he's got a wife of 8 years and a daughter of 1 year, and he will speak for 7 minutes on tips for telling a good story.
So a guy walks into a bar. The bartender looks at him and says, "Sorry, sir, we can't serve you. You're not wearing a tie." So the guy says, "I'll be right back," goes out to his car, looks in his car for anything that might resemble a tie, and can't find anything except a set of jumper cables, which he then ties around his neck, walks back into the bar, and says to the bartender, "How's this?" The bartender says, "Okay, but don't try to start anything." Everybody likes a good story. They're memorable. They ignite the imagination, and they're fun to retell. And Hank told a really good story about rocks and sand and how that applies to time management. And as we do speeches, it will be often that we will want to tell a good story. So I wanted to give you just 3 quick tips on how to make sure that your next story is killer. The first tip is to make sure that your story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I'll use the joke as an example for this. In your beginning, you want to make sure that you're setting up all the context that your audience needs to follow you for the rest of the story. In this case, we have a guy who walks into a bar. We know who the story's about, and we know where we are. We're in a bar. We also have established some kind of problem, some issue that we've got to deal with. The bartender looks at the guy and says, "We can't serve you, you don't have a tie." So now we have some kind of problem to deal with. Once we have that established, we can move into our middle. Now, the middle of your story is going to be the bulk of your time. That's where the problem gets ironed out. That's where you might have some reversals, expectations that don't get met, and how are you finally going to resolve your situation? In the case of the joke, he says he'll be right back. He goes to the car, rummages for something that looks like a tie. Can't. So he ends up with some jumper cables, which is not a tie, but at least he has something that might work as a solution. Once that's figured out, we can move into the ending of the story. But the ending of the story is also very important and needs to have a logical conclusion. It needs to be satisfactory to the audience member, and it will be helpful if it was memorable, this ending. In this case, dude walks back into the bar with something that doesn't look anything like a tie, asks the bartender if it will work, and the bartender says, "Fine, but just don't try to start anything." We laugh, it's funny, and it makes sense to us. The second tip I have for you, so tip number 1 is make sure your story has a beginning, middle, and an end. Tip 2, don't get bogged down in the details of your story. In the case of our joke, we know that we have 2 characters. We have a guy and we have a bartender. Very nondescript. It doesn't really matter if we know ages and height and all that kind of thing. We have guy and bartender. You have a picture of what that is in your mind. We also have 2 locations. We have car and we have bar. Don't know anything about the car, except it might be slightly messy. And we don't know anything about the bar, except that it's a kind of establishment where you need to have a tie in order to get served. But there's not a lot of detail given about what the panels of the walls of the bar kind of look like. I did not tell the story like this. A guy in his mid-40s in a gray flannel suit with pinstripes strolls up to the oaken door of the Penguin Club, where he strides across the wood plank floor to the mahogany and pine bar. Most of those details don't matter to the goal of the guy wants a drink. Don't get lost in those details. I also did not tell the story this way. Guy walks into a bar, which reminds me of, I was listening to an infomercial on television about some barbells, which was interesting because I was in the kitchen trying to get some Cheetos, but then I remembered, Jimmy ate the last of the Cheetos. He's such a pig. You've completely lost track of the fact that it's about a guy who walks into a bar because he's thirsty. Don't get lost in rabbit trails. Don't get lost in unnecessary details. That is tip number 2. And tip number 3, try to make the story as memorable as possible. In the case of the joke, it has several things going for it. It has a clever turn of phrase, using what jumper cables are actually used for in starting things, but it's also a phrase that a bartender might tell an unruly customer, don't try to start anything. It's clever. It has a happy ending, which Americans really dig happy endings. And it's also a situation that we can all identify with. Maybe not walking into a bar and having to wear jumper cables to get served, but you might be able to put yourself in the situation of, I'm walking into a situation and unexpectedly I'm completely unprepared for what's about to happen, and I'm going to have to improvise my way out of this in order to get what I want out of the situation. We could all kind of identify and relate with that scenario. So those are the 3 tips. Have a beginning, middle, and an end. Don't get lost in the details, and try to make your story memorable. And the next time you tell a story, whether it's in a speech here at Toastmasters, whether it's at work, whether it's at church, even if you're sitting around the living room in a commercial during a game and just want to tell something great that happened to you over the last week, these tips will help your story really stick in the minds of the people you're telling. Thank you.